Hello and welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist. I'm Liz Cavell, and today we're going to discuss religious coercion of the ultimate captive audience, people inside prisons and jails. Remember that on Ask an Atheist, we want to hear your questions. You can either put them in the Facebook chat below or email them to askanatheist@ffrf.org. And I'm joined in the studio today by none other than Chris Line, FFRF attorney. Hi,
Hello.
Chris. But we're also joined via Skype by Jeff Blackwell, our friend and litigation counsel at American Atheists. Hi, Jeff. And thanks for being here. Well, Jeff's here to talk, that's okay, about American Atheists' recent victory in court against the leadership of the West Virginia Division of Corrections and Rehabilitation on behalf of Andrew Miller, an atheist and secular humanist who was forced to engage in religious activities as a condition of his parole. Jeff is going to tell us all about that case in a minute, but just a little background. One of the more overlooked areas when it comes to state-church separation is religious coercion in our prisons and jails, but we hear about it often. Prisoners obviously are a literal captive audience, and obviously they also have little recourse or avenues to complain when religion is forced upon them. Unlike other contexts, there's no HR channels or suggestion box. Prisoners and inmates in jails and prisons are at the mercy of the state in a way that few others are. And so FFRF receives numerous complaints each year from prisoners and other incarcerated people regarding a variety of constitutional issues, including forced participation in religious treatment programs. Also restrictions on non-Christian reading materials inside prisons and jails, and special privileges for Christians or those who participate in Christian activities.
Yeah, something worth highlighting as we dive into this topic is that according to analysis by Hemant Mehta, in 2021, atheists made up only 0.1% of the federal prison population. Hemant filed a FOIA request and learned that there were 139,000 people in the federal prison system, with exactly 143 of them identified as atheists. Those self-described atheists made up a mere 0.1% of the federal population. Now, that clearly an underrepresentation of atheists, that doesn't necessarily indicate that atheists are less likely to commit crimes than religious people. In fact, it probably highlights how coercive the prison system is, with most prisoners identifying as religious, specifically Christian. And there may be a reason for that, as we're going to kind of talk about. Right.
All right. So let's get right to kind of the highlight of this discussion, which is American Atheist lawsuit. So Jeff, tell us about this lawsuit, your plaintiff, how the lawsuit started, and then how it progressed.
Sure. Thanks, Liz. Andrew Miller reached out to us, a couple of years ago now, and told me about what had been the practice inside West Virginia's prison system, which included a program called RSAT, the Religious Substance Abuse Treatment Program. This is a federally funded program provided, grant money provided by the Department of Justice. And it's provided to states all around the country in order to help incarcerated individuals recover from substance use disorders. West Virginia's program was almost entirely focused on the 12 steps. Every day, the participants had to attend 12-step meetings. The day began and ended with morning and evening devotional exercises. They were given coursework that was developed by Texas Christian University and involved a lot of religious discussion. There's a graphic on the screen now of one such worksheet they had to complete that includes, among other things, having them draw a picture that shows, quote, how I feel or would feel being taken care of by God. And this is just one example of the kind of religious content that was forced upon participants within the RSAT program in West Virginia. And interestingly, the DOJ, in their sort of frequently asked questions for grant recipients, says that the funds provided for the RSAT program have to be cannot be used for 12-step programs. 12 12-step programs can be made available to incarcerated individuals, but participation has to be voluntary, and 12-step activities have to take place in a place distinct from those funded by the RSAT grant money, and cannot be at all funded by that RSAT grant money. West Virginia disregarded all of that. So we filed our suit last April and sought a preliminary injunction, basically asking the court to do one of two things. Provide Andrew with a secular alternative to the 12-step aspects of the program and the other religious aspects of the program, be it Smart Recovery, Life Ring, SOS. There are all sorts of different secular alternatives to 12-step programs. And he had requested a number of times the opportunity to participate in those instead of the religious elements of the RSAT program, and he was denied again and again. So that was one option we asked the court for. The other one was to say, just remove the RSAT program from his requirements for parole, because the only way he was going to be eligible for parole at all was to complete this program absent our litigation. And the court, a few months later, in July 18th of last year, issued an order resoundingly siding with Andrew in this, essentially laying out how the program was very religious, and that even changing the language so that it's, God or a higher power as you perceive it, there's all this there are all these attempts to minimize, I suppose, the religious aspects of 12-step programs, but surrendering your will to science or to the universe or other inanimate things to an atheist makes no sense. Like you can't surrender your will to inanimate or abstract concepts. There's just that's meaningless. And that was that was their attempt to accommodate him prior to our lawsuit, and it was frankly laughable. So the court said he's not required to participate in RSAT anymore. The court pointed out that sure the court could order that he not be required to attend the religious elements, but he said, if by the time he goes back into the program and completes it, he'll have spent years working on this. He might have been released earlier. You've got the quote on the screen. Had Mr. Miller simply submitted to defendant's coercion and completed the RSAT, he would no longer be incarcerated, and the West Virginia Division of Corrections and Rehabilitation could continue its patently impermissible practices for years to come. Mr. Miller should not be further punished for bringing this troubling policy to light. And I thought that was great to hear from the judge, because we have seen cases like this around the country where courts have said, no, 12-step programs cannot be made mandatory by the government. And thankfully, the judge saw that here. And Andrew, I'm happy to say, was released on parole in October.
It's amazing.
That's such a good victory. So cheers and hats off to you and your allied. I know you worked in coalition with a criminal justice group in West Virginia, which is great.
Yes, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge Mountain State Justice did fantastic work assisting us in this. They have a lot of work already on their plate, but they really took this case very seriously.
Yeah. Well, I'll just say, when I read about this, I was just so amazed by Andrew, because if I were in prison, which, hopefully never will, but I would do anything to get out. You know what I mean? And I'm obviously an atheist.
Absolutely.
Very strong in my beliefs of atheism. But if someone said, go attend this church thing, Christian thing, and you'll get out, I would do it in a heartbeat.
Well, because,
amazing.
It highlights, right, obviously, Jeff, your lawsuit and the choice that Andrew Miller faced highlights how unbelievably coercive these government practices are, like the one in West Virginia, right?
Absolutely.
And the flip side of the coin is that it's so hard to address unconstitutional conduct like this because, and you wouldn't expect anything else, incarcerated people are going to do what they have to be released, even if it's on parole. And, when they're faced with the prospect of, okay, well, we can fight this, but you're going to be your status is in limbo. You're going to remain incarcerated. Oh, by the way, lawsuits take months to years. Or you can do it and get out. I mean, that's no choice at all. But of course, that's where the coercion is. It's like you're going to do what is necessary to regain or keep your freedom. And that's the problem.
We had a number of additional other potential plaintiffs who ultimately decided that they didn't want to rock the boat. They just, wait there, whatever it was, 6 months, a year, however long to get out. And, just grin and bear it. And I can't fault them for that. Sticking your head out in a context like this is, I don't even, I like the words. It's, has to be a harrowing experience. I can't imagine what that feels like when you're in that position. So my hat's off to Andrew for sticking with the case. And I mean, my hat's off. I have no judgment to those who chose not to participate as plaintiffs.
Right. Well, this is why religious coercion in this context, and not just, it sounds like your client and plaintiff was just trying to get the opportunity to get paroled. Meaning, once your client's paroled, they're still under the supervision of the Department of Corrections. They're still, their liberty is still completely in jeopardy. And oftentimes, the 12-step programs or this religious programming is a condition of parole itself or probation. We see that all the time as well. And so the reach of this type of religious coercion by the state is pretty far-reaching, and I think people don't realize just how. And your worksheet was horrible, but people don't realize just how religious the programming really is when we're talking about something that we think of as a culture as just like AA, and it's does more good than harm, and it's for everyone, and it's ecumenical, and the truth is it's actually really religious. It's not suitable, to say nothing of it's not evidence-based to help people with substance use disorder. But it does violate the conscience of anyone that's an atheist or, presumably a non-Christian in some of these programs. So it's just wrong.
Yeah.
And AA's, sorry, Chris, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to make just one point that I had just thought of, that the other unfortunate thing when you're kind of tying religion into prisons, jails like this, is that I think as a part of the coercion, there's this interesting thing about religion in that it's a way to show you're a good person. So like, for example, if you want to, let's say you're a prisoner, an inmate, you want to show you're reformed now. Well, the easiest way to do that for a lot of these people, and I think that's why this comes up, is that they're like, oh, I found God in jail. It's a very popular thing to say and show. And it's a way to, without doing anything, say, oh, look, here's evidence I'm good now. Obviously, an atheist doesn't have that opportunity because it's just, I'm not doing bad things, they don't have that benefit of doubt, whereas it's really easy. And I think we see that a lot of prisoners, and people who come out and are, they find God in prison, and it sort of works as a corollary for being like a good person. And I think that's problematic.
Yeah. Well, and it works in a feedback loop of, indoctrinators who are ready to take advantage of the vulnerability of the population and the need that they, have to curry favor with wardens and DOC, officers and all the rest. So, it's...
Yeah, very similar to school issues. So for example, like we as atheists are not trying to get into schools to give atheism to kids, you know what I mean? Like, whereas there's a lot of preachers who do that. Same thing with the prisons. Like, there's not a group of atheist secularists like trying to get into prison to talk and work with prisoners, in that way. Whereas we see all the time, ministries love to go after prisons and use that as a way of advancing their mission. So, we'll talk about some more of these later that FFRF has dealt with, but it's extremely common in jails and prisons for ministers to come in. And then even worse, they're sort of allowed in, because what they do is the jails or prisons will say, well, these prisoners have religious rights, which they do, but they'll then kind of extend that to say, well, I guess we got to let these preachers come in and try to, as part of their rights, which is obviously not the same thing as looking after their actual rights.
Yeah. Yeah, and Liz, you mentioned that it's often a requirement of parole, and even if it's not an express requirement handed down from the court, people who are on parole have to obey their parole officers. And if a parole officer says, absent any instructions from the court, I want you to attend 12-step meetings, the parolee is obligated to follow that. We had an individual. I won't go into too many details. He chose not to again file suit because didn't want to rock the boat. But he raised an issue with his parole officer that they were requiring him to attend AA meetings, and they said, "Well, try it for a month, and we'll revisit this then." And I had to explain to him that's not permissible. You've raised an objection. They should allow you to participate in some equivalent secular program. It's not a question of try it on and see how it fits. That's just absurd. So, I just want to highlight that these are not always even express requirements. They are, imposed in other ways within the system.
Yeah, I mean, and you're talking obviously with this case, like sort of official. This is like built in. This is the official system, the way it works. Mm-hmm. So you can just imagine how much unofficial stuff there is. A particular warden, a particular prison, someone working who's just very Christian, and is then sort of using their position to kind of just manipulate that in there and kind of just encourage. We've talked about favoritism. It comes up a lot of like Christian prisoners and things that maybe like, oh, well, me being the good Christian administrator or someone working in here, I'm going to like give preferential treatment to prisoners who I know are also Christians, and things like that. And there's really no way to police that because they're in charge. I mean, it's completely captive audience there.
Yeah. You raise another issue with preferential treatment, and that's access to things that are, like favorable, like a change up in your day, right? Like Rebecca Markert, our legal director, once went up to Cheetah, which is a women's prison in Wisconsin, to speak to, I think it was a humanist group, for the first time meeting, like having access to social meeting time. And they were saying that, they'll go to the Christian meetups and things like that just to be able to, get out and socialize and have something to do. And when those groups get preferential access to, meeting rooms or, bringing in outside speakers or, holding group activities, there's going to be pressure for people to attend and conform and all of that. So the coercive pressures are everywhere. But when we're talking about AA, we're talking about direct governmental action for the most part, even when it's not in a sentencing order, which as a PD in my past life, I saw plenty of times full on in a sentencing order.
Oh, I'm sure.
Defendant will attend AA throughout, 10 months of probation, monthly, or whatever it is. But like you said, Jeff, even when it's ordered by a probation officer or a parole officer and it's not, technically written into a sentencing order, that's ordered by the government just as much as if a judge would have ordered it. So the pressures are immense. And obviously, the stakes and the consequences are as high as it gets.
Yeah. I mean, it's unfortunate. I mean, I'm so glad you're able to help him in this instance because we do get, at FFRF, we get a lot of complaints from prisoners. They come in the form, they're written on like notebook paper, and oftentimes, it's just the sort of, it's not like some big systemic violation like this, relatively easy to challenge. You've got proof, you've got documents, evidence, and this is like, of course, the thing going on. But a lot of things we hear about are things that are just this one official is leading prayer at times or something like that. I mean, obviously something we can write to the prison warden and be like, hey, we heard prayers being forced upon people in this prison, and hopefully they'll do something about it, but a lot harder to challenge. Yeah,
it's insidious. Yeah. Well, before we move on to some other complaints in the context of incarcerated people, I wanted to point out, Jeff mentioned before we went live that we do see state-ordered AA in other contexts, and that's really important too, because as we were talking about before, these programs are extremely religious, and many federal courts, I think most or all federal courts that have considered the question, have found these programs to be religious, and therefore not appropriate for governments to order people to complete with consequences hanging over their heads. And oftentimes we see that not only in the context of prisons and jails, but in professional licensing contexts. So oftentimes, or sometimes, we will hear from doctors, nurses, or other professionals who have a state-issued license that has been suspended or that is in jeopardy because of behavior that has been the result of a substance use disorder. And in order to get back their license or to keep their license, these people are ordered by the state licensing board to participate in AA, NA, and other religious 12-step programming, which is just as illegal and unconstitutional and a violation of the rights of people who are trying to protect their livelihoods and their professional licenses, because obviously the state is ordering them at the cost, or with the threat of their professional license to participate in religious programming. So they too are constitutionally entitled to a secular alternative to that type of programming.
Yeah, and in a lot of those situations, this aspect doesn't so much apply in the prisons, but in a lot of those professional licensing situations, attending these programs, the 12-step programs, can cost the person money. They have to, pay to participate in some of these programs from the complaints I've received. And it's just deeply frustrating how systemic and pervasive AA is in our culture, when it is not only expressly religious, but if you dig into the big book, which is their, let's say, scripture, there's a whole chapter 4 is titled We Agnostics, that basically says if you're a non-believer, you're just doomed to an alcoholic death, is, I think, a direct quote from the book. Yeah. It's expressly anti-atheist. And if you were, if the roles were reversed and Christians were being forced into a program that said, Christians are doomed to fail and all of that, there would be an outcry. And it doesn't happen with AA or any other 12-step equivalents. It's just infuriating.
Yeah. And that's to say nothing of, and we won't get into the inefficacy of AA as substance use treatment, which it is not. So it's compounded, the insult and the injury compounded to atheists who are also, trying to recover and re-enter life with substance use disorder. It's just a bad situation. Well, we're going to talk a little bit, Jeff, about some of the other complaints we've been seeing and receiving from within the prison system. So chime in with anything you guys have been experiencing over at American Atheists. I know we've all seen some of these complaints, especially lately.
Yeah, I mean, in just the past couple of weeks, FFRF's written to 3 separate sheriff's offices for hosting and promoting mass prisoner baptisms, something we're seeing all the time. In September 2023, the Smith County Sheriff's Office partnered with a pastor to host a baptism for inmates. The official Facebook page for the Sheriff's Office noted that Pastor Faust works tirelessly at the Smith County Jail doing ministry work with inmates, and that Sheriff Smith is a strong proponent of the great programs like this leading people to Christ. In August 2023, the Lumpkin County Sheriff's Office hosted a baptism for 6 of its inmates. The Sheriff's Office promoted this government-sponsored religious ritual on its official Facebook page, where it noted that 6 of our young men got to experience something that they'll remember for the rest of their lives. They got to publicly confess their faith and commitment to our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ at a baptism in the river performed by Brian Sutton and Ricky Wood. Brian Sutton left them with the word of wisdom before the baptism. Baptism is a great reward, but it comes with great responsibility. I hope each of you walk straight, admit when you have fallen, and get back up, set goals, and find yourself at church. Ricky would advise them to not fear what man says, just stay focused on the Lord and do not let temptation overtake you. I leave you with Matthew 10:28. I look forward to seeing what God does in your life. very proud of you all. Sheriff Stacy M. Gerard. So signed by the sheriff on the Facebook
Signed
page.
by the sheriff.
Yep. So and that's what we see with all of these. It's the sheriff's office boasting about how religious they are, how they're, doing the. So even if they want to claim, oh, these inmates are just doing their religious freedom rights, they have the right to do this, they're signing off on it and saying, look how cool we are.
Right.
And in August 2023, a concerned Anderson County resident reported that the sheriff's office promoted Christianity on its official Facebook page. It posted 9 women made the decision to accept Jesus as their personal savior and were baptized this past week. Pray for these ladies as they begin their walk with Christ. Hashtag one family, one mission. Hashtag baptism. Hashtag jail ministry. So you see how they might think they can get away with this by pretending like, look at how great religious freedom is in our jail. We are going to show you all these people accepting Jesus and sneak all these messages in where we're clearly promoting religion.
Well, there is a real world where an inmate wants to become baptized and requests the accommodations necessary to do that while they're incarcerated. Right. And a prison or jail, a sheriff is usually like in charge of the jails, or, a state DOC or a prison warden could make those accommodations. But you can tell that's not what's happening here. Like what's happening in these instances is organized events. And those things don't happen inside of prisons without the backing of the prison, the government entity, right? The warden, the sheriff, the DOC or the prison chaplain or whoever it is. It's not initiated by inmates. It's not an accommodation of an inmate's, religious request or religious need. It's religious activity being foisted on inmates by the government. And those two things are, direct pillars of the First Amendment. One is prohibited, one is required. And these government actors in jails and prisons don't seem to know the difference.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm also, it's interesting to me, that they're using the images of these incarcerated individuals to promote something, but and I'm wondering how, have they? Do these people even know that their photos are online as participating in this?
Right.
I have some interesting questions about if somebody's not a Christian, comes from a family of a different religion, and then they see a photo of their family member being baptized, not because they are really interested in it, but because that's what everybody's doing, and you want to be, in good favor with law enforcement while you're incarcerated, that can have some serious knock-on consequences once you're out and back with your family, who now are like, what,
Yeah, I mean, even more extreme.
Why'd you make this decision?
Right, even more extreme. One of the posts listed the names of the inmates that were baptized.
Wow.
For what world, what purpose could that possibly serve?
Yeah.
To be like, well, these are the 6 people who were baptized, and give them their names, unless you're trying to either imply they deserve favor, that in some way we need to let you know so you can hold these people up or something, because there's no reason to be giving out the names of the people involved.
We had an incident where a halfway house that people were assigned to was holding Sunday worship services in addition to AA meetings and all this other stuff, and we're live streaming the worship services online, and also congratulating individuals by name for their 5th day of the program, their first month in the program. It's supposed to be Alcoholics Anonymous.
Oh my gosh.
When you're so blatant that you're live streaming it on YouTube, it just boggles the mind.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about the affiliating the jail or prison with Christianity. I mean, and we see that it works. So in a lot of those posts, you read the comments and it's like, so glad to see that our sheriff, is a man of God, or so glad this or that, or, which is clearly the intended outcome. And then you see, oh, this is working. Like we, the sheriff's office, are able to affiliate ourselves with Christianity, which unfortunately, particularly in the case of sheriffs, which are elected officials, that can then, guarantee that they're going to keep being elected because people are going to say, well, it's just a tool that can be used, unfortunately, by a politician to hold their place. So there's really, unless we're able to take a lawsuit on it, there's really no downside for them in doing it. It probably helps them.
Right. And I mean, it's analogous somewhat to the public school context in that, the actual people that are being affected by the government's unconstitutional conduct are so vulnerable. And so it's a predatory relationship. The power dynamics are just not seen in other public contexts. Like it is, or there's no relationship analogous to that in the regular government official, public citizen relationship. Like it's such a predatory relationship, and there's so much control. I mean, just talking about, live streaming and posting people's names on the sheriff's office Facebook page. I mean, like, these government officials have complete control over so many aspects of people's lives. And so it just makes the violation of rights that much more egregious because it's such a predatory relationship with such an imbalance of power. And they're so entrusted, they're entrusted with so much power over people's lives, and it's just abused.
And think about this. This is what they're posting on Facebook. I mean, this is what we're seeing, where they're showing it to the world and they know they are.
Yeah.
So just imagine behind closed doors when, no one's getting into that jail or prison except the prisoners and the workers, what kind of stuff is going on.
Liz, I'm glad you mentioned that power imbalance in the context of schools, because it reminded me, it's not school related, but I'm sure you've experienced this too, where we get complaints all the time about forced religious activities, be it 12 steps or just prayers and whatnot in the military context, where the any impulse to step out of line to protect your rights is going against, whether it's your unit, your branch of the military, what have you, and is incredibly abusive in that context as well, because obviously people are away from their families, away from a huge amount of their support system. So that's just one more context where.
And it's another context where the government, there's almost this fig leaf of the government accommodating religious needs of military members, because they do have government-imposed burdens on their ability to exercise their religion, potentially. But, that gets warped into just an environment where the government actors promote Christianity at every turn and just completely infuse the entire institution with promotion of the dominant religion. And again, like you said, Jeff, like the power dynamics it's similar, right? Like there's such an imbalance of power in the military environment where there's chain of command, and it's absolutely just 100%, hard authority, top-down authority. You have the same vulnerability.
It makes it so much easier for the sort of informal, unofficial requirements that Chris mentioned earlier, where it's one unit commander. Because the DoD's regulations on this are pretty solid.
Yeah.
It's the way they're administered down the line. I don't want to get too far away from the prison context and incarceration. But
what we're talking about though is a context, and I mean, arguably, there's nowhere more coercive than, at least for adults, than jails and prisons in terms of the relationship between the government and the individual. The power dynamic in this context is just absolutely essential to the constitutional questions.
Yeah. So we can wrap up this discussion with one final thing. We've had a recent victory that might be related to American Atheists. We might be able to thank them for it.
Right. Your lawsuit is making ripples in Appalachia. Let's see.
Right. In November, someone required to participate in the Mid-Ohio Valley Adult Drug Court in West Virginia reported the program requires participation in Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous. Our complainant provided paperwork from the court listing the requirements for each phase of the treatment program, which clearly indicated participation in Alcoholics Anonymous was compulsory. Our complainant requested an alternative secular recovery treatment, specifically the SMART recovery program. This request was denied by the Regional Day Report Center Executive Director. The central, as you know, the central components of 12-step programs such as Alcoholics Anonymous are religious in nature. We pointed that out in a letter. These programs require recognition of a higher power and require participants to turn their lives over to a personified, gendered God. While requiring a religious addiction recovery support program as one of multiple options is permissible, the Mid-Ohio Valley Adult Drug Court violated the First Amendment when it required participation in solely religious programs. So we sent a letter off and we received a response from Judge Jason Wharton. I've reviewed the documents that you submitted and directed the drug court probation officer to modify the documents to reflect a program such as Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, SMART Recovery, or other program approved by the court. He said, I was not aware of the specific language in the form you included, but I believe the modified language will make it much more clear to participants from the onset that they have other options besides Alcoholics Anonymous.
Well, that's a fantastic response from the judge. Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe he was aware of other things that had taken place around the time in West Virginia that might help,
But again, that's someone in drug court, so that means you're under the jurisdiction of the court with the threat of whatever punishment to your life or liberty. Oftentimes it's probation that's being administered, or some other type of diversion. But you're required. The point is you're required to complete the 12-step program in order to avoid some next step of punishment. Oftentimes, it's a suspended jail sentence, or it's a violation or a revocation of your probation or parole, or you lose out on the chance for a diversion program. And that's what's going on in so many courtrooms across the country, including this little one in West Virginia. And this one was resolved by the person with the authority, which is the judge administering the program, and with just correspondence and without the need to file a lawsuit like your organization had to. And that's really great. So maybe your lawsuit made some ripples. And it's always good when a court is repeatedly pointing out in opinions and orders that these programs are religious and that it's a violation of individual rights for states to require citizens to participate in them. So well done again.
I'm really glad to hear that.
Yeah. I'm going to see if there's any audience questions since we're just cruising right along here. And let's do a little of that before we let you go, Jeff. Okay, here we go. I don't think we know the answer to this, but we can muse. Do these problems happen in prisons in any other secular countries? Who knows?
I have no idea.
Who knows? That's a great question. I mean, I tend to think, unlike other secular or, third world democracies, we tend to be one of the more religious, just culturally. But who knows?
But also, a lot of other countries don't have the Establishment Clause in the way that we do, and that it's a lot more. They don't have that explicit push against religion. They obviously have religious freedom usually, but not the sort of the other half of that. So I'm not sure how that plays out in other places.
I will mention. I'll dip into my international law education a little bit and say the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights includes protection for conscience and religious beliefs. And I mean, I think there's only a handful of countries that aren't signatories to it.
Like us.
I think the U.S. signed, but we never ratified it, which is often the case because our system with treaties is bizarre. Anyway, and that I believe should protect people against that sort of forcing of religion on them in those settings. But to the extent that different countries enforce it or abide by the requirements of the convention, I don't know.
Yeah, I just point out that so much of the pervasiveness, I think, of some of this conduct by individuals that are tasked with, government authority is cultural. Like Chris was pointing out earlier, and we were talking about, individuals in these positions of power have so much individual power, right? Like you're acting in your official capacity as a warden or, just a prison guard or whatever. You're acting in your official capacity, so you're doing state action, but so much of what you choose to do with that power comes down to cultural things. This is a really good question I want to jump to. Do parole boards take religion into account? And if so, isn't there some coercion to conform? That's a really great point. And I'm sure the answer to that is yes. I'm fuzzy on this. They shouldn't. But I think they have very wide and broad discretion on what they can consider. And I'm sure...
One of the things that we kind of touched on earlier is one of the ways people show they have,
reformed.
Reformed, thank you, is to say they found God or what have you, which is the kind of thing that parole boards shouldn't acknowledge. I mean, that is not a sign that you've done anything to learn from your mistakes, alter your behavior, what have you. So it's really something that parole boards shouldn't pay any attention to, even just from a factual, logical perspective, but also certainly from a constitutional perspective. Nevertheless, I have no doubt that plenty of parole board members do take that into account.
Right.
Yeah. And I mean, kind of on that topic, it's this cyclical problem because it's the dominant religion that's being emphasized and promoted and given all the, it's being emphasized in government-backed programming. And so it's like, that's a choice, but that is what inmates are going to gravitate towards, what there is to show reform, right? And if your environment is dominated by, there's 10 Christian groups you can join, or there's this and that chaplain and there's that ministry, and you can, these are the ways that this is the programming that's available for you to show that you're, engaged and you're doing things, and to tell the parole board about. I mean, that's what I always get so frustrated with in the school context too, because it's like, what this religious programming, there's an opportunity cost there, right? There's secular programming that's not being offered to incarcerated Americans because there's such a glut of, Christian programming being pushed in prisons and jails. And that's what's really just kind of sad, because, we don't know what there would be room for in terms of programming and community and support groups and, treatment programs.
Right.
Okay, here's a...
I think it's...
Go ahead, Jeff.
I just want to mention, jumping on what you said about schools, I think it's worth flagging that Texas recently passed a statute, and now there's a bill pending in Alabama that essentially allow public schools to bring in chaplains instead of guidance counselors.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they don't have to be certified in anything. They just have to pass a background check. And, talk about an opportunity cost where children are being deprived professional counseling from someone who's licensed, and instead are getting
right, again.
Well, who knows what from a religious
and the people who pay the costs are the students, right? They're the ones that are missing out on secular counselors with, credentialed backgrounds in their schools because religion.
Related to the actual cost, I mean, this is kind of what I was bringing up before. So both the prison and school context, it's like, okay, well, you want to have these real professionals come into the prison to help these people. Who's going to pay for that? The state's got to pay for that. They got to put more money into their prisons. Oh, it turns out a lot of Christian ministries, hey, we'll come in and do it for free. And then same thing in the school context. Are we going to pay a guidance counselor
And that's
tens
part of the
thousands a
argument in the
year,
Texas bill
because
is
all these
what a savings.
Right. All these chaplains are chomping at the bit to get in here and talk to our kids. Like, they'll do it for free. They just want to come in, you know? I mean,
Gee, I wonder why. Certainly not to promote their perspective.
No, they just want to help.
Yeah, you know what's cheaper than secular counseling? Not secular counseling.
Right.
Just nothing. Just people.
No, and nothing's gone wrong given, religious leadership access to children.
Yeah, no, it's fine.
Yeah, what could go wrong? Okay, there's a few more questions, and a couple of them are actually good. So let's squeeze this out. What makes it, we've talked about this, but I'll give you guys some final thoughts. What makes it so easy for prisoners' rights to be violated this way? Is there so little oversight in prisons that allows religious indoctrination to run wild? Are outside groups like FFRF and American Atheists the only defense against it? And I think this is a worthwhile question. It's an insular institution, and courts are actually really deferential to prison and jail officials because they recognize, maybe rightly or wrongly, that it's really hard to run a prison and you need a lot of deference. You don't need a lot of court interference in what you're doing for pedagogical reasons and security reasons and things like that. And so I think there's a combination of forces that make it as insular as it is.
Yeah. In fact, one of the reasons, so I mentioned that the judge in our case, we offered a couple of different accommodations. One being exempt him from the religious aspects or create a system that has a number of different opportunities for people to engage in secular activities. And the judge in part opted for just removing the requirement from Andrew's list of parole requirements because that involved less meddling of the courts in how the prisons operated.
Right.
And judges generally don't want to do that. There's also the prison systems are very often kind of a black box. A lot of, public records laws that would allow you to get access to government documents have exemptions for documents related to the criminal justice system, be it, requests that might impinge in some way on security in the prison system. And that could come down to, requesting the daily schedule of inmates, because that could be a security risk if you know where inmates are at different times of the day. So they refuse to hand those documents over. Right. And so we can't get a good picture of what's going on inside a prison system in a lot of instances. It really depends on the inmates being able to recognize that there's a problem and actively reach out to us.
Which is asking a lot. I joked kind of at the top, but that's the problem too. There aren't systems in place often for inmates to, have grievances. They have to actively recognize or wonder if they have a right and reach out to some third party, extra system entity like us.
Right.
And, oftentimes don't have the resources Chris mentioned. We get handwritten letters. It's not always as easy to reach out or to even figure out what your rights are.
Right. Related to that, two things I'll say. One, even people we hear all the time, people will come forward and be like, hey, maybe they're reporting a violation in their school or something, and they'll say, I had no idea you guys existed or that this existed or any of this. And that's people out in the real world with internet that can go ahead and look, get all the, to try to find things. So now you imagine you're in prison. And then also I was going to say, related sort of the handwritten notes and stuff, unfortunately, there is a disparity in the education of those in our prison system. I mean, it's not like all prisoners are college educated people who know their rights or understand right. We get a lot of hard to read letters written, from people who clearly struggle even to read and write, let alone know how to reach out and uphold their rights.
And it's a perfect storm of factors that are stacked against, prisoners, availing themselves of their own rights. And it just sort of highlights the vulnerability of the population and the power imbalance of the context.
There's also just a societal aspect that people just don't care as much. I mean, some of our complaints, we've received complaints from people in jail for the rest of their lives, in prison for the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
And so people, I think, are more, in those situations, more likely to say, well, yeah, technically they have rights, but like we just don't care as much about someone who, you know, maybe killed someone or did something serious. And it's like, you know, that's another aspect that can make it harder for them to uphold their rights.
Yeah, of course.
And that's all on top of it's just hard to provide legal representation to people who are incarcerated, because it's very difficult to have a privileged conversation with your client when they're incarcerated and the prison's potentially reading your mail or your phone calls are being recorded, because all their phone calls are being recorded. And so then when it's an issue of them trying to protect rights that they don't really know the bounds of, it's just layer upon layer of challenge.
All right, well, I'm going to ask one more question to maybe steer us on a quasi-positive note to end on.
Okay.
How can atheists help to stand up for prisoners' rights outside of prisons? Are there ways that we can help break down the stigma against prisoners to help them feel empowered against coercion? And I think, you know, we're kind of getting at that 0.1% number, which there's no way is an accurate reflection of the religious identity of people in prison. But we've been talking all hour about the many reasons why inmates rightfully feel stigmatized if they're non-religious and get along with the dominant religious forces in prison. What can we do just as atheists outside of prisons?
I mean, this is less specific, but I'll just say, obviously, working with groups like American Atheists, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, just to protect our secular government and ensure that we have a secular government. You know, the stronger our secular government, the more it trickles down to every aspect of that government, from prisons to schools. The stronger that separation between church and state, the more we can guarantee everyone's rights. And then you're you know, it's not a specific thing to help prisoners, but all areas are affected when we're able to strengthen that separation.
I'll mention a couple of different things. One is if you want to provide support to incarcerated individuals, one thing you could do is send non-religious reading material to prisons for prisoners to have access to. Prison libraries are limited. I know in the RSAT program that Andrew was in, there was reading material made available in the RSAT unit, but it was virtually all religious and exclusively Christian. So something as simple as providing, a copy of, your favorite book or Bertrand Russell or something for them to read that is promoting a non-religious worldview can help within the prison population. Outside the prison population, if you're able to, if you're in a position to potentially hire somebody who's, out on parole or formerly incarcerated, don't continue to punish them after they have served their time. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out that American Atheists is promoting and advocating for a couple of bills around the country. One that's been vetoed twice now by Governor Hochul in New York, and I think it's potentially advancing in Colorado, where that would require courts, when sentencing someone to some sort of substance abuse treatment program, ask them if they have an objection to a religious program, and if they do, provide them with a secular option there at the start. And I think that goes a long way to, if we can change the culture in the courts, that can go a long way as well here.
Right, which should already be the status quo, because as we've been talking about all hour, ordering religious treatment programming to the exclusion of any other alternative is actually a violation of the rights of the very people these bills are trying to protect. But, calling your state legislator, or, paying attention to the action alert, signing up for action alerts from American Atheists and FFRF, and knowing what is going on in state houses and in Congress to advance some of these protections for prisoners is also useful.
Yeah, I mean, related to that New York bill, I mean, just the fact that the governor has felt like she's able to veto this without any punishment, it's a very reasonable bill, and yet I probably rightly think she's not going to face any consequences, and that's why we need people to stand up for those things, to make their consequences if you're not going to, support reasonable things that help protect the separation of church and state.
Right. Her attitude was basically, people already have these protections. Why are we requiring the courts to tell them that they have those protections? And I mean, it's just.
I don't know that there's data on this, but I know that those numbers exist out there in the space, which is, this is a right that exists that is regularly and rampantly being violated in courtrooms across the country.
Absolutely.
It is a routine practice in state courts everywhere, criminal courts, to require AA or NA by name of criminal defendants in sentencing. So, I mean, there's your answer right there. But yes. Support our groups and pay attention and listen and watch our spaces for the work that we're doing. We are continuing always to take complaints from prisoners and their allies, outside of prisons and jails, and advocate for the rights of the non-religious everywhere, including in prisons and jails, and on probation and parole. So you can support our work and support that work by supporting our orgs. So that concludes Ask an Atheist for this week. Thank you so much, Jeff, for talking with us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, don't forget, we also have a weekly broadcast TV show. It's Free Thought Matters, and this week, Annie Laurie Gaylor and Dan Barker have a conversation with philosopher A.C. Grayling. This preview, you'll hear him describe how he realized that religion wasn't real.
I had the very good fortune indeed, really, to be born into a family which didn't care about religion. So my first encounter with it was at school. And of course, at school, there were Catholics and Protestants and Jews and Muslims and all sorts of people. And it just seemed to me, no different really from the different candies that you have in the candy store. And since they believed different things and spoke about their faiths in different ways, it just occurred to me that there wasn't anything very serious about it.
You can see Free Thought Matters on TV stations all across the U.S. and also on FFRF's Facebook and YouTube channels.
And don't miss Free Thought Radio. This week the show features Margaret Downey, chair of the Thomas Paine Memorial Association. You can find the show at ffrf.org/radio.
Check out the latest episode of our We Dissent podcast. Our newest episode drops today, and it's our New Year's mailbag episode. Listen as me and Rebecca Markert answer listener questions about religious liberty and so much more. We Dissent is actually a joint production of American Atheists and the Freedom from Religion Foundation, so listen and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, or you can check us out online at we-dissent.org.
If you want more information about the Freedom from Religion Foundation, check out our website at ffrf.org. If you're a member already, thank you. If not, please join us, and we'll see you next week on FFRF's Ask an Atheist.